last composer that we are talking about, and it's one of my favorites. Well, okay, he's my favorite from the Baroque period. His name is Johann Sebastian Bach, born in 1685 and died in 1750. Hey, wait a second, that's the year that the Baroque period ended. Well, that's because basically when Bach died, it signaled the end of the Baroque period. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in Germany and lived in Germany his whole life. He was a church musician as well as a court musician, I should have said that. He was a fabulous organist. And sadly, his musical genius was recognized mostly 100 years after he died. So, Bach was born to a family of musicians. His father was the director of the town musicians. But sadly, Bach was orphaned at about the age of 10. And then at that time, he started studying under his brother. His brother was also a musician, a very talented one. And can you remember who he studied under? Actually, I can't off the top of my head, but he studied under someone who goodness gracious, who was that? It wasn't was it Telemon? Maybe it was Telemon. No. Goodness, I have to look that up. Okay, but anyway, so he studied under his father, or no, his brother. And his brother and him kind of it was not a good relationship all the time. It might have been because Johann Sebastian was incredibly talented and picked up things very quickly, and so his brother might have been intimidated by him. Some things that Bach wrote. He wrote cantatas. He wrote concertos. He wrote for organ. He wrote for chamber, and chamber instruments. So like a small group of instruments and orchestra. He wrote for harpsichord. He wrote for clavichord. Again, those are like two instruments. We'll talk about those later. But those are like the precursor of the piano. He wrote for all of these things, but he never wrote for opera. So I guess there's just only so many hours in a day. But he was a very prolific composer. He wrote thousands of pieces. And we actually at St. John's have a complete library of Bach's music. And be sure to ask me about it because we have all of the recordings of every single piece that is attributed to him on CD. So something else that he was known for. Oh goodness. Okay, so to be perfectly honest, I took a class on organ during the summer, and we spent 2 days talking about Bach. 2 days, 4 hours long, talking about Bach. So I'm trying to keep this to like 5 minutes. So he wrote a lot, and it's all amazing. Let's see. So he took a couple of jobs in a couple of different places over the course of his career. One of those was in Leipzig, and he took that after Telemann turned it down, which is kind of funny. He developed the use of fugue, which is when you have like a theme, like a short section, and then you take that theme and it's like canon, only a bit more complicated. So let's see what else. His music is very innovative for its time. So a lot of times, so harmonically innovative. So that means that he like pushed the limits of what would be acceptable. So music before then it had rules and it had things that it was doing. Like if you did a certain chord, it would only go to another chord. Well, these rules started shifting at this time period. And Bach was he was one of the people who was causing that shift, causing that change. And because of that, the rules of music when it comes to chords and what is acceptable and what is not. Those were shaped by Bach, and we attribute it to Bach. He also pushed the limits when it came to the instruments of that time, and you could say that the instruments of that time, and we'll talk about this in later videos, the instruments of that time evolved because he was doing all this stuff, and they needed to change the instruments to make it work. So for example, the clavichord, if you played in a certain key, it would sound so. Like if you were playing in the key of C, where you use C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, it would sound good. But then if you wanted to play in the key of A flat, A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, it didn't work anymore because things weren't tuned correctly. And so he was one who pushed for changes to the instruments so that they could be used in any key. And so things like the trumpets would only be able to play in one key, while he pushed for them to be able to play in multiple keys. Oh goodness, okay. Some of his most famous works, well, okay, you've heard a lot of his pieces, and I'll make sure that there are videos posted, but some of his one of the things that he's known for is how intentional and how focused his music is, especially his religious music, because he worked for the church in a couple of different places, and his music was so thoughtful. He put so much thought into every single note and how he would take the text and portray it. So the music that he wrote was his own like reflection on his faith, and his faith was very important to him. He was Lutheran, and he studied Martin Luther. He studied all of these wonderful writings, and he studied his Bible. He knew his Bible very well, and so he would use the music to bring the text to life in another way, because music can do that, and he understood that. And so that was so important to him, and so how he portrayed every single thing in music was amazing. So like, just for an example, in one of the pieces, it's talking about sighing and hurt and hope. He would throw in all these like this descending sound, and it sounds like someone's sighing. In another instance, so in music theory, having something called parallel fifths is a sin. Is not a good thing. If I did that in my assignments in college, I'd get big red X's through those things. Like those are against the rules. And so he would avoid those. He knew exactly how to do that, except for when he wanted to talk about sin. Then he would throw parallel fifths all over the place, and ask me what those sound like. So all of that, among many other things, he was an incredible musician. Not an easy person to get along with. He actually got thrown in jail by his employer at one point because he wasn't doing what the employer wanted him to do. But that's because he had his own way of making music, and he had his own way of creating. So there's so much more about Bach, and I encourage you to do some Googling and find out more, because he is amazing. And the rest of these musicians that we've talked about, there's a reason why their names are still around. Sadly, Bach wasn't really, he was known at the time as a good organist, and his music, people were like, oh yeah, that's great. But then after he died, it kind of faded away until about 100 years afterwards. And then other musicians, other famous composers started looking at his music and saying, wow, this is amazing. And so they put together public performances. And now, something that you can do is so Concordia University, Chicago, in River Forest. On the campus is a Lutheran church called Grace Lutheran Church, and they do a Bach cantata every year. Cantata is it's a text from the Bible set to music, and it's amazing. So they do a Bach cantata. It's actually basically every month during the school year. They will do one a month. So there are opportunities to go hear that and see that, and it's so if you ever had the chance, go listen to Bach. All right, I'm gonna stop this ridiculously long video, and we will now move on to closing about the different styles of the Baroque period, just so you can understand how the music sounds in comparison to other styles of music. All right.